Well, thanks for having me come and visit and talk to you a little bit about the Vanderbilt poll. I have a variety of different objectives in today's talk. I suspect to some degree what I want to do is take on some views about conventional wisdom, so to speak, about Tennesseans. In fact, some people have talked about some of their experiences that differ with, so to speak, conventional wisdom, and really how the Vanderbilt poll fits into this conception. And basically the broad point is that if you kind of ask people outside of the state, people view the state as far more conservative than in fact it really is. The Tennesseans are far more pragmatic than they are ideological. And so I want to have some data and talk a little bit about that. Partly, it's particularly important to do this in this environment at this particular moment because public opinion polls actually, if done properly, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means if done properly, polls moderate our understanding of public opinion. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, politicians of all stripes, and there are obviously many politicians in this room, everybody tries to figure out what the public's thinking about some particular matter. And they take whatever kind of information they have and they try to aggregate that into some sort of reading. And prior to public opinion polls, which really came about in the 1930s, politicians didn't have a very good sense of what people were thinking. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, one of his famous quotes that isn't in the movie, though it's kind of hinted at it a couple of times, is he said that he really wanted to do what the public wanted. He just didn't know what the public wanted. Okay? Well, that's really true back then. It's sometimes true now, but polls have changed that. Polls actually, if done right, give us a good reading of what the public thinks. But without that reading, we tend to get a very skewed view. And that's particularly problematic in today's era because people who have opinions, and they tend to be both on the left and the right, they tend to be ideologically charged, they tend to care a lot, that they skew opinion. And because we now have so many access points, whether it be Twitter, social media, the internet, blogs, the ability to send an email very quickly, that the end result is that the extreme segments of society have had a greater opportunity to express their opinions than the vast majority, the moderate citizens of this state or of any state. So it's particularly important to have polls because they do provide some sort of moderation. In fact, my next door neighbor said to me during the course of the election, he asked me who was going to win the presidential election in 12, and I said, well, I knew he was going to be happy. I said, Barack Obama was going to win re-election. Oh, I thought he was going to have a heart attack. And he says, I don't know anybody who's going to vote for Barack Obama. I said, yeah, I know that. I said, but he's still going to win. That can't possibly be true. Well, of course it was true. It was a close election, but nonetheless, Barack Obama won. Why? Well, because that particular individual just didn't know many people who would favor. Or today I had a great conversation on the radio as I'm driving this way. Todd, who's the? Ralph Bristol. He can't believe the Vanderbilt poll that shows the Tea Party people actually like Lamar Alexander. Can't possibly be true. I don't know anybody. I said, okay. I don't know anybody who's a UT football fan either, but that doesn't mean there aren't a lot in the state. I mean, let's just keep that in mind. He didn't like that particular analogy, but it's.
They'll start admitting again after a while.
So, in Tennessee itself, as a state, actually, MTSU did an occasional poll. Actually, Vanderbilt did a poll in the 1990s of the city of Nashville. Tennessee has done occasionally a poll, but there really wasn't very good polling data. Occasionally, the Tennessean, the newspaper, would hire Mason-Dixon. But again, it wasn't somebody who had a feel for what the state was about, and they also weren't paying enough money to get very good polling data. The end result is there's been a lack of polling data. And it's something that I've thought about and worried about for a while. Unfortunately, I was able to convince Nick Zeppos that this was something the university should do, that the university should invest in doing a high-quality poll that would actually provide good, accurate readings of what the citizens of this state think, do it in a nonpartisan fashion, and then share the results. And let the results come out as whatever they do, but be committed to that in an important way. And Nick loved the idea, and he made it happen, and the Vanderbilt poll was created. And a couple of things about the poll that I want to talk about. First of all, its real mission is to be nonpartisan, is to provide information to policymakers, activists, and to citizens about the public opinion in the state. We are truly committed to that. In this particular day and age, you certainly want it to be nonpartisan, so one of the things that we did right when we started it with the help and advice of Beth Fortune, who runs News and Public Affairs over there, is we pulled together a board of Democrats and Republicans, and we asked them ahead of time, and these are people who are not currently holding office, prominent people in the state, Chip Salzman, for example, on the Democratic side of Roy Neal, ask them for what they think are the important issues facing the state and start to get the poll going. And then once we have the poll together, we then send it to them for them to vet and to assess and to comment on. And oftentimes they've caught little things that sometimes would have had an effect, not because of any partisan effort on my part, but simply because of mistakes. And so it's worked out pretty well. Tom Ingram has been really critical in helping us with this poll, making sure that it is in fact viewed as a credible set of information from both sides of the aisle. But to do this is not cheap. The typical poll these days that Mason-Dixon would run costs about $15,000. You can do cheap polls really easily today, partly because telephone rates are down. You can even do robo-polls, whatever. But with the rise of cell phones, with the rise of answering machines, you have to make multiple callbacks. Because if you, for example, just call people one time and then take that as your data, you get a lot of elderly women sitting at home answering their landlines. That's what you get. You've got to make an effort to reach out to all people through the cell phones. It's an expensive undertaking. Vanderbilt spends $40,000 on every poll. And that doesn't count my time. That doesn't count Josh Clinton, who's my co-director's time. That doesn't count the graduate students who help it. Just to do the particular poll. I mean, it's a massive undertaking to do it right. But again, if you want it to be nonpartisan, you want it to be accurate, you've got to put that kind of money into it. You also have to have the statistical expertise to be able to interpret the results and the sampling expertise. I have a little bit of that, but frankly, the person who really has most of it is my colleague, Josh Clinton. Josh has a master's in statistics from Stanford University. He's disgustingly smart. He frustrates me all the time because he gets to a point, I eventually get there, and then he lets me think it was my idea. Very nice guy. He actually is hired by NBC News to analyze the exit polls to predict the outcomes of elections. So if you're unhappy, he didn't do 2000, by the way, but he did. He has done 2008 and forward. I mean, that's just his skills. And so again, that's a particular talent that you need to be able to do this kind of a poll. In addition, Vanderbilt's going to do this twice a year going forward. We started in 2011, and the real advantage of doing that is we're also going to develop the context to understand each and every poll. So as we get more and more polling data, we'll be better able to understand and set it in a good context, and that's certainly a problem that didn't occur before. So I think this is an important institution. It's something that we take seriously at the university. It's something that we've tried to share. Any of you have any thoughts or questions or ideas, certainly just share it. Share it with me. The results are always available online. Occasionally I'll get somebody, the Beat Lamar group is a pretty persistent group, and somebody says, well, you've been hiding these data. No, not really. It's been talked about quite a bit. I mean, they just don't like the fact that 62% of people who identify with the Tea Party approve of Lamar Alexander. They don't like that. But that's, again, the advantage. They have their anecdotes. I'd much rather have evidence, but that's showing my social science bias. Well, let's go through and talk about some results, because that's what you're really most interested in. And again, if you have any questions at any point in time, don't hesitate to answer. What I wanted to start with is simply the partisanship in Tennessee by region. I don't do a lot of regional breakdowns in these data, partly because the sample is designed to represent Tennessee. It's not designed to represent the East or the West. But if you take a look at the western part of the state, these results basically make sense. The western part's more Democratic. The eastern part's more Republican. Again, that all makes sense. In general, 51% of Tennesseans, this is of registered voters, are Republican, 41% Democratic, about 8% independent. These independents, some people say, well, there's a lot more independents than just about 8 to 10%. Well, this is a measurement issue. If you ask people, are you a Democrat, Republican, or independent? About 25% of people will start out saying they're an independent. Then if you ask them, well, do you lean to one party or the other? Then that number drops a lot. It turns out the people who lean are reliable partisans of that party they lean towards. I mean, you all can think of friends who you have who say, oh, I'm an independent, but it turns out that person's voted for the Democratic Party in every election over the last 60 years. It's probably a partisan, okay? They just like to say they're an independent, they're above politics. And these numbers make rough sense. But when you try to do a lot of regional breakdowns in a statewide designed sample, the problem you face is that the western part of the state is basically Memphis. And of course, the western part of the state is much more than just Memphis. But the way the sampling procedures work, that's true. If you do a national poll and you decide to pull out only the people who live in California, which is about 1/6 of a poll, again, you have trouble because it turns out it's basically LA and San Francisco, given the way they're going to do their sampling on average. So you've got to be a little careful. But nonetheless, the reason I show this is that if the Vanderbilt poll showed that the Democratic Party was in the majority and that we were really a blue state, you'd all want to take a break right away because obviously there's not much credibility to that. And it works roughly in the way that it should, was as you move west, you're going to find slightly more Democrats, and that's definitely the case. Did I go? Okay. So,
Get a copy of these
yeah, they're available. And if you have any, and if any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. In fact, it was a really fun 25 minutes last week with John J. Hooker. The man deserves my time. He hung out with Muhammad Ali, what the heck, right? And he wanted to have all these data on what I was saying about Lamar. And so I kept sending him to his email account or whatever. So anytime anybody has questions, this is a public resource and the university is committed to making it. So we also have a website through Vanderbilt that you can also get a lot of these data. This is again just, because the real breakdown that's going to matter in today's environment when you think about politics isn't whether you're from the east or the western part of the state. That obviously matters, but it's really whether you're Democrat or a Republican. And here's just Bill Haslam's popularity and the state legislatures, and you can see it works as you might expect. Governor Haslam's more popular among Republicans, but notice 54% popular among Democrats. That's really quite impressive. In fact, I've spent some time with people in the national media pointing out that the average popularity that the governor has is about the same as Christie, but Christie's is polarized. The Democrats don't like Christie at all, but the Democrats here in the state do value the governor. And even the state legislature. The state legislature takes a lot of criticism, rightly or wrongly, but it certainly does in certain quarters, especially nationally. But again, the public is responding pretty favorably, and even Democrats are responding reasonably favorably. And that's worth pointing out. Oh, I got to keep remembering.
Has this changed significantly over the last few years? I mean, obviously, we had a Democratic House, Democratic Senate for a long period of time that changed. Is this different, or is this?
Well, if I come back in 5 years, I'd be able to answer it, but we've only been doing this since January 2011. When the governor took the oath of office, we started, so we don't have a sense. And that's part of the frustration here, is that I believe, and there's some data that suggests that Bredesen was a pretty popular governor. Was he as popular as Bill Haslam? Probably not, given the kind of numbers that Haslam's enjoyed, but we just don't know that. There are some bits and pieces from MTSU's poll, but there's some problems, I think, with that poll that make me a little nervous about it, but it tells a story that Bredesen was popular. So one reason why we want to keep doing this is that the kinds of questions that you're asking will be in a much stronger position just in 5 years to be able to answer. But Haslam's popularity over the time of the poll, which has been done 6 times, I think now, or is it 5, has been very, very steady state. It's moved a couple of points, and members of the news media want to seize on that movement, but it's basically noise. I mean, he's remained pretty popular. Here's numbers on Corker, Alexander, Congress. Nobody likes Congress. That's not a big surprise. Obama, we talk about polarizing. There's some polarizing. 83% of Democrats approve. Only 8% of Republicans do. And here's the number that's causing the people who want to beat Lamar so much unhappiness, the 62%. 15%, by the way, of the state self-identifies with the Tea Party, just 15%. If you ask people, do you like the ideas of the Tea Party? It's not an issue of self-identification. You get it to about 40%. But it isn't like the Tea Party is a major force as far as in regards to self-identification. Again, Alexander's popularity, he's doing quite well among Democrats, 54%, a little bit better than Senator Corker. But again, Corker's doing a little better among Republicans, but this is still, by comparison to other political figures in other states, it's still very non-polarizing. Just take a look at the Obama numbers. It's really quite staggering. Look at U.S. Congress. Again, you know, Democrats like them a little bit more, but I bet you if you pressed them, they wouldn't know why. But that's just a guess. Okay, here, and remember my broader theme that I want to try to pass along is that Tennessee's more moderate than what it gets credit for, the Tennesseans they get credit for. So here is a comparison of what the citizens of Tennessee want, which is attention to various issues in the blue, versus what they perceive the state legislature doing. Now, as you can notice, that there's a big gap in regards to guns and regards to social issues, that the state legislature was focusing more attention on it. Now, the thing about that story isn't necessarily that the state legislature is. It's a story about what the news media are covering about the state legislature that's going to matter. But nonetheless, I mean, you can see that the Tennesseans perceive the state legislature not paying enough attention to the economy and jobs, though my guess is if you took a look at the actual legislation, you'd find that that perception's not quite judged.
Not just state government, so the governor's carved out.
Yeah, we just ask about the state legislature in this case. The goal here is that the public the public again is like, the rest of the country. They want jobs in the economy as the major focus. And that they're not particularly worried about guns. And remember, this poll was taken right after the tragedy in Newtown. And so even then, still, the citizens of Tennessee wanted focus on that. And you take education, healthcare, you bring that, 3/4 of the top priority of the state should be one of those three things. Again, just one small piece of the puzzle. Not a big surprise, but again, one that speaks to moderation. Here we ask a bunch of different questions on gun control because it was right following the Newtown incident. We also asked, by the way, about the big issue of guns in parking lots. Tennesseans favor that. Democrats favor it, not by dramatic amounts, but it's just basically favored. The state legislature did something that, in fact, the public supported. And if you believe that government rests on the foundation of public opinion, the government was doing a good thing, or at least in this case, state legislature and the governor. The thing that I'm interested in pointing out, two things worth pointing out, is that background checks are popular. It doesn't matter whether you own a gun, not a gun, you do it by Democrat, Republican, background checks are supported. Now here's an example again about how squeaky wheels can get the grease, because the NRA, for example, as an interest group, is totally opposed to anything along these kinds of lines. Yet the public, whether you're a gun owner or not, favor background checks. So again, a statement of kind of moderation. The thing that I find most interesting is allowing teachers to carry guns in school. If you own a gun versus not own a gun, it's a big difference. As a member of, I always think that anybody who really wants to have faculty carry guns into school, we should just get a bunch of academics to go up on the Hill and talk to these people and realize you do not want these folks armed. You absolutely do not want to arm these folks. So those of you who, I have 3 or 4 members of the faculty that I have in mind that would be really good. If you want to stop this, we'll just send them up and you realize you don't want these people to be armed. You really don't. That would be my own view. But in any case, again, the state's conservative on guns, but background checks still have lots of support. Okay, now I want to talk, because the governor in yesterday's talk, I was told by Kathy, understandably talked about health care. He also talked about education. We'll have some slides about health care. This is really an interesting slide because basically what it says is that, do you support the decision to have the federal government run the health care exchange? And basically Tennesseans didn't like that decision by the governor. And then if you further ask about the decision not to support Medicaid expansion, again, they didn't like that. They want Medicaid expanded. Now, that seems to fly in the face of the fact this is a conservative state, but it doesn't fly in the face of it. If you think of it in this way, Republicans on average tend to favor the state government solving problems. Democrats on average prefer the federal government to solve problems. And so when you make the thing, you want the state to do the exchange or the federal government, it's a no-brainer. You want the state, especially if you're a Republican. But of course, what's making this an issue that's so complicated and therefore hard to poll on is that part of the reason why somebody like Governor Haslam or the state legislature might not want to do the state-run health exchange is that's buying into Obamacare, and that they don't want to buy into Obamacare. And part of this is a campaign not to allow Obamacare to take effect. If you were able to explain that to people, yes, you would then get very different kinds of numbers. But I think the bottom line, what this number suggests, is that Tennesseans do see a role for government playing a role in health care. Again, when you if you ask people about the Affordable Care Act, people actually think it's a reasonable thing. If you call it Obamacare, all the wheels come off the wagons, because then it becomes a partisan kind of statement. But these results are not saying that what the governor did wasn't the most popular thing, it wasn't the right thing. What it's saying is that as a predisposition, Tennesseans would rather see the state government do stuff than the federal government, and that makes perfect kind of sense. Okay, here's some stuff on education. And Randy, I don't know this one here, the top one, we actually ask a question about whether the Hope Scholarship should be just given to the best students possible, or should it be given to the best students who maintain a certain kind of GPA but are from lower and middle income. And the results are really quite striking. 62% favor giving the Hope Scholarship more to lower and middle income people. And again, why? Well, because they need the help. I mean, Tennesseans care about people. And it's not like they don't want the government doing anything. And in fact, they're willing to have the government do things to help the less fortunate, whether it be Medicaid expansion as suggested earlier, or in fact, something like a Hope Scholarship. I will say that this particular question, we were going to ask this question, and I'm not quite sure how Representative Steve Cohen heard that we were going to ask the question, but he called me up and asked me to ship him the question wording we had, which I did. And he said that we should, because we only had it give scholarships to low-income students. He recommended that we add low and middle income, which made good sense. And that's an example of something we hadn't quite thought about, and we can test it again and do it all different kinds of ways. One thing, by the way, go ahead, Randy. Yeah.
I was just going to add, before you change the subject, a couple of other stats that might be interesting to know. But in the U.S., we're number 3 in direct student aid of all the states. 42nd post-secondary attainment, but we're number 3 in the amount of scholarship money we give to our students. And second, in the need-based part, so we're in the lowest 20 percentile in the amount that we give on need-based scholarships. So just
Yeah.
a couple of extra stats.
Well, that's interesting. The need-based stuff is something that is so important in a lot of ways. One of my favorite stats is that, of course, I'm part of Vanderbilt University. Vanderbilt's tuition is $40,000 a year, which is absolutely just false. It's not $40,000. The average tuition someone pays at Vanderbilt is $18,000 a year. Why? Because there's a huge amount of money dedicated to need-based scholarships. That's so critical to access to education. The Hope Scholarship and making that possible for someone to be able to go to a UT or to Vanderbilt, depending wherever they happen to be in the state, is just great stuff. Charter schools, they're popular. Doesn't matter how you slice it, they're popular. You can slice it by Democrat, Republican. In fact, if you look in the western part of the state and you just look at the African American community, they favor it even more because they see all the problems with the school system in the state. Voucher programs. Actually, this question about the limited voucher program we came up with, we got some assistance. I thought about trying to ask this kind of question and reached out to the folks in Governor Haslam's office because there was a big battle over that, and so we added that question. You can see the limited voucher program, even though limited is misspelled, which makes me crazy, by the way. Now I'm going to think about it the entire ride back. And I'd like to blame a graduate student, but I can't. I did it. But in any case, you can see that there. Louis, you said how much time? 5 minutes, okay. Here's just a quick on salaries for public school teachers. There's very few people who think that public school teachers are paid too much, which is a sign of mental health. Public school teachers paid about right much. The finding that I find interesting, the Tea Party thinks they're paid about the right amount, 52%. But basically, there's a lot of support, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, for paying school teachers more. Again, not a big surprise, but something that would be of value. I want to get to some findings at the end because I think those are the most important. But this is issues of gay rights in the state. the whole country is moving towards more tolerance on gay rights, gay marriage, all like that. The state is going to move along with it. 62% favor basically partner benefits. That's a pretty sizable number. Opposing legal recognition of marriage, again, is almost 50%, but not quite. But if you combine the civil unions and support gay marriage, you're a little bit over 50. And this number is going to continue to change. And it's certainly changed over the last couple of years. These numbers surprise people because, again, people assume nationally that the state is very intolerant. The state is not where Massachusetts is in regards to gay rights, but nonetheless, it's still pretty progressive, or more progressive than it used to be. Okay. Here is a quick result. I want to get to the second slide and spend a little bit of time on that, hopefully not more than 3 minutes or whatever I have left. If you ask people, do you want basically people to work together with members of the opposing party, or do you want to stick to your values, that is to be ideologically pure? 75% of Tennesseans want people to work together, not stick to their values, not stick to their ideological guns, be willing to work together, work across the aisles, which is something that, frankly, our senators and our governor and members of the state legislature are committed to. And I think it's really important to see those kinds of numbers. And even if you slice it by people who are Tea Partiers, even the Tea Party folks see that basic merit. I think one of the things that's going on, and gets to my broader point, is that without polling data to try to moderate our views about what Tennesseans or any group of people are like, we tend to be defined by the extremes. We tend to be defined by those people who are active, those people who get the microphone and speak into it, or write a blog or whatever. And that gives us a misreading of where the state in fact lies. And this last piece of data is the one that has always struck me as the most telling. If you ask Tennesseans where they are ideologically, they're conservative. This is very liberal, 5 is very conservative. They're at an average of 3.35, which makes sense, they're conservative. And this is just on social issues. But look at where they perceive their fellow citizens in the state. Much more conservative than the state legislature and Haslam. Why is that? Because again, without the moderating influence of public opinion polls, without the data that they provide, we tend to be defined by the extremes. So that if you, for instance, live in Massachusetts, you'll hear much more action on the left side of the spectrum, and people are going to be much more liberal than, in fact, the basic moderate tendencies. Again, Massachusetts is a Democratic state, but it's not quite as liberal as the perception's being. And also notice that economic issues, Tennesseans are more conservative than social issues. And again, if you ask people what the conventional wisdom is about the state, they'd say we're much more socially conservative. The data just don't point this out. And Tennesseans think their fellow Tennesseans are a lot more conservative. And this has serious representational implications, because when the state legislature does something that's really conservative, many Tennesseans may say, well, that's what the citizens want. That's what I hear people saying in the newspaper or through blogs or wherever. We need to get a full representation. I don't want to suggest that polls are a panacea. Absolutely not. But a well-done poll, asking questions in a fair fashion, gives you some real important information that can help check what's now facing this country, especially as we become more and more polarized. And we're probably not quite as polarized as we think, because it's the squeaky wheels that are getting the grease, and they tend to be the ones that are more ideological. So just for summary, and then I'm going to close, is Tennessee more purple than red? I'll let people make their own decisions. But I do think this state has more affinity for someone like a Howard Baker than a Ted Cruz collectively. And certainly our state leaders suggest that the priorities of the state are not tilted towards social issues. There's some support for some gun control under some conditions. Tennesseans do want government to help the less well-off. There's surprising support for gay rights, given the kind of caricature that's often painted. Tennesseans want to get things done rather than ideological purity. And finally, we're more moderate on social issues than we think our fellow citizens are. And maybe we just need to stop giving grease to the squeaky wheel, but we all do. I'm a chair of a department. Guess who I pay attention to? And they have a permanent job, so that's the other. I was saying to Todd about the downfalls of tenure. So that's That's what I got. How much have I eaten into their time?
We're good.
Okay.
Here's what I'd like to do. Let me.
Well, to hear a Vanderbilt professor give university football, Tennessee football, is a hard thing to take. I remember when Vanderbilt didn't have a football team, but that's. Louis, three or four observations. One, some of this would surprise me, yes. The fact that there's more, particularly the Tea Party issue, the fact that people of both persuasions, liberal and conservative, feel that folks ought to work together more. That's not. One of the things, and I won't elaborate on this. There were two things in there. Having looked at what I've done for a living, I guess, and knowing a good number of people in K through 12 education of all sorts, I get a little concerned that I don't see interest in education ranking as high as interest in economic issues, and I sometimes put those together. And then with the seeming concern that K through 12 teachers ought to be paid more, I'm delighted to see that, but I don't see that very often creeping into actions by state legislators and local government leaders. We still are expecting to have fantastic people and start them out at $30,000 a year or less.
This is on or not. I think I'm not surprised mostly by what I saw in the poll, mainly because Tennesseans speak to these numbers when we vote. We elect. Hold it. Oh, it's taking. I'll do that. All right. I will say that again. I'm not particularly surprised by the numbers because Tennesseans support these numbers when we vote. If you look at our history, I'll go back to my time in the political arena from Winfield Dunn forward, with maybe one exception. We have pretty much supported moderate governors, moderate senators, with the exception in the last few years of the General Assembly. The General Assembly seems to be more conservative than what, frankly, we have elected statewide or how we support on the federal in presidential elections. So what you confirmed in my mind is pretty much what I've really thought about Tennessee. I tend to think because we're a border state that we are a moderating force. We're not northern, we're not southern, we're a border state, and I think a lot of that goes back from the history of where Tennessee was from 200 to 100 years ago at least. So I think we do want to work with the other side. I think we elect people who, by and large, certainly on the federal level and the state in the governor's race, we elect people who want to do that. We have a history of it. And I said, with the interesting exception of when my party, the Republicans, have taken over the General Assembly and have tended to be a little more conservative on some issues, the gun issues, for instance. But I'm not surprised, and I'm frankly glad to see this confirmed. I think East Tennesseans, we would have said this about ourselves probably since the Civil War, that this is what East Tennessee has been. It hasn't been as true in rural West or in Middle, but we've seen a moderating force in there as well. So I think for me, it pretty much confirms what I have believed for many years.
I'm not surprised at all. I think Tennessee is a red state with big blue polka dots. Or blue freckles, however you want to look at it. And so this wasn't surprising to me at all. From my vantage point, talking to people every day and every week, what I notice is there is political branding, and people kind of group up under political ideas and brands as they measure themselves against their peers. there's code language and code issues that they use just to certify to one another that, hey, I'm on your team. But when you get people in a group where they don't have to politically brand themselves, they seem far more pragmatic. They look at the issue, and then they'll make a decision based on the issue. Because I looked at the popularity of Phil Bredesen, and I'm looking at the popularity of Bill Haslam, and in both instances, when they bring something to the people of the state of Tennessee, if it really does seem pragmatic and to make sense, Tennesseans seem like they go along with it. Although, in these media spaces, when you get into the political branding of issues, it seems like there's this strain of talk that kind of says, I've got to make sure that everybody knows that I'm either liberal or conservative, and I'll do it by using this issue as a proxy for that. May not even be relevant to what they're actually discussing, but I got to put up some points on the board to say, I'm conservative, I'm liberal, and I'll leverage from this issue to do that.
Okay, this is a blank slate here. This is the first Leadership Tennessee class. Based on this polling information, let me start with John and then ask you three to comment as well. What should this group focus on for the next 9 or 10 months, based on the poll? John, you want to go?
Well, I'm happy to go and play off on what President Johnson said. I mean, it does seem, even though the state cares about the economy the most, that's because we're in a recession. It doesn't, and obviously the state needs to tend to that, but issues of education matter a lot. And I will also point out there's some interesting state regional differences where education becomes much more important to people in the western part of the state. Mostly, again, that gets a Memphis sample. There's going to be some differences. But I think education is something that remains really very critical. Healthcare, I mean, look at the chunk of the economy that healthcare involves. Vanderbilt, for example, is wrestling with all different kinds of healthcare issues. UT Medical System is going to be doing the same thing, private. I mean, these matter, and it's such an uncertain time, too, because of the Obamacare and whether, there's so much pushback going on, but all these things matter. And so what I just, again, I'm not a policy person. I'm just trying to provide the information and some context. And again, sometimes polls don't, aren't able to tap the things that we want to tap. I mean, healthcare is so complicated that I wouldn't want to put a lot of, attention to a particular result. We try actually to test a lot of different question wordings because the way the question's worded matters a lot. But these are things that do matter, and I think the fact that these three distinguished individuals find some credibility in the results make me feel better, because really we're about trying to be in this poll of just providing information that others can use.
Yeah, 2 comments. One thing, having, I guess, done lobbying for the University of Tennessee since 1963 in one form or the other, John, an observation I made, and whether this would show up in polling or not, I don't know, is I still have a sincere belief that legislators over time will do what the people of Tennessee want them to do. Now, that doesn't necessarily say they do what I want them to do, but after a while, I think maybe those folks read the tea leaves.
Yeah.
Governors, I think, tend to do that much better than legislators do in terms of speed of action. On Lewis's question, looking at your data and your polling results, John, it would seem to me that looking at this wonderful collection of folks out here and all their interest, that a Leadership Tennessee could focus very well on 4 or 5 primary items that are there and figure out how we statewide can address them, starting with the economy, and then I'm going to reflect my biases. What can an improvement in K-12 education, however you do it, and how can public and private higher education be a factor in assessing and helping out with health care and economic development? I think and looking at your polling results, John, there's some common interest in all parts of the state and with the 2 parties in the state, and whatever the Tea Party is, I guess that's a party. But there's some common interest there that I think you all can capitalize on.
certainly look, there are a lot of people in this room that are very engaged and invested in education in our state. And I know this is certainly one of the governor's, if not the main priority. I think every conversation I have in East Tennessee, and I think it holds true mostly around the state, is workforce development. How are we going, how do we train this next generation for the jobs that are coming, that we don't even know what the jobs are gonna be right now. I know Tom Mason, everybody at Oak Ridge struggles with how do we have this next generation of workers? How are they gonna be trained? Randy is very involved in this, I can't remember the name, but it's something by 55% of the workforce, 25 by 2025. By 2025, having 55% of our workforce with a 2-year degree or more. Tennesseans have not traditionally valued education, particularly higher education, and I think that's something that we all have to really make a concerted effort to change. Jamie is involved in this. The governor is certainly very laser focused on it. Randy's down there. We've got to figure out how we change the perception of the value of education in Tennessee. 20 or 22%, something like that now, that have a degree, higher ed degree, and that's just not enough. I think it comes from the history of where we've been economically, and not having the value placed on it. But that, to me, is something that collectively we've got to figure out how we change that attitude and how we get the value placed on it, and then how we train for the workforce that's going to be needed in our state. Again, I think we've got a lot of people focused on it in Tennessee, but it is something you all as a group should certainly take on if you have not already. And then I would agree with Dr. Greer that healthcare, Rick, you're down there trying to figure that out. We don't know what's coming. My impression is with Obamacare or Affordable Care Act, whatever you want to call it, we really are still pretty much in the dark about it. We don't know what will happen in the next federal elections, what will happen with that. So there's so much uncertainty about that. How does it impact our state? And so to me, those two issues are what you all really ought to focus on.
I heard this quote the other day by Alvin Toffler, who said the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write. They will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn as necessary. And so as we think about education, I have kind of a contrarian view on this because I have no idea what the future is going to be like. So I really do think the greatest thing we can do is work on people, helping them develop a superior, highly adaptable skill set, but then the inspiration to do something in the state of Tennessee. So that if our future 25 years down the road is something we never imagined, that we have a class of citizens in our state that can reconfigure themselves in a way that addresses the needs of our state at that time. And I don't know how you get to that. I don't merely want young people educated, I want them inspired, and I want them inspired to invest their intellect here in the state of Tennessee and to do it in a highly adaptable way. So rather than pre-programming people for success, I'd rather have them ready and adaptable. And I don't know how you as a group promote that, but maybe a step beyond education to inspiration and adaptability.
Thank you. I'd love to turn it open to questions.
I was watching Ben Bernanke last year when he was talking about what the Fed's job is. And they were saying the job of the Fed is full employment and some other things. And how are you going to do that? And he was talking about quantitative easing and all of the other stuff. But he said, we have other tools. And when questioned about the other tools, he said, communication. and as odd as this may seem, if you are cognizant of the fact that you live in a soundbite culture, there's going to be a high demand for people to learn to communicate better. The job of leaders is to take complex ideas and to reduce, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And so it is to take broad concepts and big ideas, and I'm not saying reduce them to sound bites, but certainly, who was this? There was this physicist who was going to explain some idea, and he said, I'll turn it into a freshman level course. And I asked him, and he said, how are you coming with that? And he said, I'm not done yet. He said, well, why can't you do it? He said, because I don't understand it yet. All right? So maybe the onus of responsibility is going to be this, that when we have big ideas, we're going to have to figure out how to communicate those ideas more effectively and more powerfully, so that we start people, maybe we start with small bits of information, but we lace it in such a way that it pulls them into deeper levels of research, or we invite them into a deeper conversation. But we've got to learn to communicate better, and we have to stop screaming at each other. I mean, that's going to be the coin of the realm. But I really do think being simpler and clearer in our communication is going to be a big part of how we move things forward in the future, because people are not going to give you an hour and a half to explain all the fuzzy details, so it's going to demand a better understanding and a better ability to communicate.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either. I do know that we are living in the texting generation, where everything is a one-word, reply, or a three-word reply, and it does concern me. I don't know about yours, but my children won't answer a phone anymore. If I don't text, I don't communicate with them. So we have really taken the art of communication and reduced it to three or four words, or one or two. And that really does bother me. It bothers me that we no longer write letters, and particularly from the history standpoint. We're not going to have those rich, wonderful letters that our parents wrote and I wrote as a young person. All of that is gone, and so we're losing so much of our history, written history, because of the way we communicate. The 24/7 news cycle has changed everything, because they now have to find news, or they make it up in order to stay on the air and to appeal to their viewers 24/7. Think about that. When we were, when I was young, I'll speak only for myself, we had 3 channels, maybe, and now it's endless. And, at midnight, the Star Spangled Banner played, and we went off, and you went to sleep. And that has so dramatically changed how we get news and how we communicate, and really just our entire. I don't think anything has changed our ability to go through issues and think about it more than 24/7 news. So I'm not sure how we do it, but I know that it is an issue, because this is the way our next generation is going to communicate. We're not used to that.
Can I add one other thing to that, just real quickly? The soundbite may be a starting point, because I've noticed what my daughter does. She'll see something, and if she sees or hears a soundbite, she'll go, then she goes to the internet and she Googles it, or she goes on YouTube looking for a further explanation. So the sound might be the first trigger, but once they get beyond that trigger, do they have resources there that explain, especially in smaller windows of time, that will lead you to that next trigger?
Well, but she's smart enough to do that. Not everybody is. I mean, that's the other problem we have, is this generation that is willing to accept what they hear in a soundbite without going further. The information is there. There's no question about that. But is this next generation willing to ferret out the rest of the story?
Let this 80-year-old make a comment, okay? I'm trying to adjust to sound bites, but as you all in this room and those with whom you are involved, look at this matter of how we communicate today. I would make a plea that somewhere in our educational process, kindergarten through 12 and in higher ed, in the technical schools, that we spend a little time in seeking to get people to read on occasion and think and analyze what they're hearing. Sometimes I hear us get so caught up in the speed of transmission, the speed of communication, and I'm going to reflect my bias. Sometimes my history, political science upbringing comes out, and I would like for some people to develop a knack for analyzing things, and like most political scientists, it's neither black nor white, it's somewhere in between. And I would hope that in the educational process somewhere, we can cause young folks to do what these, to explore, to Google, to somebody, I said, you can Google that, and they said, I didn't know you know what Google was. I don't, but it sounds good. But a plea for those of us in the education business at whatever level to get people to be analytical and to think logically about some things and don't buy just whatever comes across the tweet today.
And that, well, I was going to say, that leads me into Common Core. That sort of leads me into the, into the Common Core standards, which there's a gigantic debate going on about that around the country, and certainly in Tennessee, and I know this is one of Governor Haslam's priorities as well, but that's the point of the Common Core standards.
You may have to explain that.
All right. There is a national, but I'm not an expert on it by any means, but Jamie, where you want to talk about it? Yeah.
I can talk to that.
Kind of give them an understanding of what it is, and then we can talk about that.
Sure. Well, and I can yell.
Oh, well, they want them.
I need you on.
Sorry. Well, it's interesting that you say that. We're having a parent conversation tomorrow night through Stand for Children on this very issue, and it's the Common Core standards are certainly leading people to a higher level of analytical reading and understanding with informational text. And I had a parent ask me, well, how does that really change what teacher practice is? The answer to that is the PARCC tests, which are coming, that everyone has probably heard some little inkling about, but here in another year, we're going to have a different kind of standardized test for our K-12 students. And that test will look very different than what they look like now. And the best example I can give is if you have a student taking a test now, and it's a reading test, you're going to have a couple paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs, and you're going to have a couple multiple choice questions along with a fact-based question. That's what they look like now. The PARCC test will be moving this to a student would have to support or analyze why was Amelia Earhart important in history. And they would be expected to read 3 different items. The first item might be an informational text article about Amelia Earhart written by so-and-so, and you would know the background of that person who wrote it. The second piece would be you're going to have to watch, because these are going to be done online, a section of a documentary about Amelia Earhart, and then the third could be a section of a book about Amelia Earhart written by someone. And so you're looking at 3 different pieces, and then there will be 4 or 5 questions around what you just read and how you compared it, and then write about what do you think using facts from these 3 different articles. And so the time that it takes you to do this is more like an hour and a half, as opposed to the 10 minutes of reading something and then actually responding in multiple choice. So it's drastically different. And so when the tests look that different, it will drive the instruction to look different. As we know, the assessment will drive the instruction at some point. So it is a very big difference.
And it's possible, I haven't looked with that particular, yeah, I've got one on. I've tried to make sure I haven't said anything under my breath either. It's possible we could take a look at the Memphis group, that subsection, and maybe even Shelby County and see what it says. It's hard to be sure it's very representative, but I think it's just a statement about the economy. And right now, because President Johnson was making the comment earlier that education didn't rise higher in the state priorities, that's partly because of the situation we face. As the economy gets better, which we all hope it will, education will pop up and other kinds of issues, and potentially crime will as well. But nationally, that's true too. There's certain pockets of the country which are worried about crime, but it's just the economy, and the economy because of the problems we've faced over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, this poll was written with a certain intent in mind. You guys are all brainstorming and thinking about a lot of important issues. The value of education, for example. I mean, if there are things that you can imagine that would be useful to put in a poll like this, that would give us useful information and give your group useful information about what Tennesseans are thinking about, once you've done your thinking or whatever, let me know and I will do my best to include it. I mean, we thought about asking about Common Core. We thought about it. In the end, I just did not think the Tennesseans yet knew enough to give them a good opinion. There was, right as we were doing the polling, there was the controversy with Governor Haslam's brother, and a lot of people said, "Are you going to ask about Flying J?" I said, "No." I said, how do I ask about, when I mention the name Haslam and not get people thinking it's the governor versus this? It's just an impossible question to ask. We did ask about DCS because that had gotten enough coverage. But there are tough ones to ask. But if there's certain things that are questions that have been asked before, but just core basic information about what Tennesseans are thinking about, let me know, because we'd be happy to ask those kinds of questions and then have an answer to the kinds of things you do. Because as a pollster, I don't have a very good sense of it, but I could develop a better one.
So what I'm hearing from this is if Leadership Tennessee needs a poll done during the year, John will do it.
I didn't,
No.
I didn't,
Go ahead.
but I will ask questions.
Got a number of hands up. I'll start there and then come over here.
We may have asked at some point over the last 2.5, 3 years a question on climate change, but we haven't asked many. And part of the reason is that, as suggested early on, is that partisanship drives most of our attitudes. If you're a Democrat or Republican, I can predict pretty accurately most of your opinions on most issues. And as soon as you enter into a partisan conversation, it's going to shape the conversation. So you talk about global warming versus climate change, that in of itself has a partisan ring to it, because global warming isn't a term that responds as well for Republicans. Well, but climate change, still, it's so laced with partisanship that it's hard to get at. But again, it's something that would be worth doing. But collectively, this country is less worried about that issue. I mean, we were talking about crime and not being something that's very high on the agenda, and that's a surprise. And for a lot of you, you might say, well, look, climate change is really important. That needs to be a bigger issue. But for the American public, it isn't. But again, it speaks to that fact that the economy is right now, as pointed out, is driving everybody's concerns. And until the economy really turns around. But even at its highest point, climate change really never entered into the public's awareness. But that's where leadership comes in, because we need to have a serious conversation about that. And we'd be happy to poll on it if there's a question that we could do that wouldn't be just tapping into people's partisanship. If I ask people whether they like Obamacare or not, I might as well just ask partisanship again.
I just want to follow up a little bit on that, because I've been involved in some work with climate change. I'm one of the, well, I wouldn't say the few Republicans. I am probably one of the few Republicans in Tennessee that have been out front about supporting cleaner energy, alternative fuels, that sort of thing, and got very involved with one of my clients 3 or 4 years ago, actually advocating for the Waxman-Markey bill, which Todd can tell you was a surprise to his senator. But I think it's not really on anybody's radar screen in Tennessee, and I think if you polled, you'd probably find maybe a majority don't even believe there is such a thing as climate change, because it has become, as Dr. Greer said, it's become such a partisan issue. Republicans many years ago were the party of conservation. Teddy Roosevelt, Richard Nixon created EPA. I mean, it was a Republican policy. And I think frankly, in our state, when Al Gore invented global warming, then it really divided the parties. And in this state, and I can tell you with some authority, because I've been very engaged in this issue, there are very few Republicans who are willing to say they even believe in the climate change. I believe in it. I see it happening. I've read enough to be a real advocate that we've got to do something about it. But the partisanship on this issue is astounding to me, particularly when I go back to the Republican Party used to be the party of conservation. So I personally would love to see something done about that to bring the parties closer together on that issue, but boy, is it a divisive one in our state.
Okay.
You kind of alluded to that the state legislature may be a little bit more conservative than the state. I think there's a couple of things that need to be talked about there. One is redistricting, and so therefore how these districts are created can then aggregate to a set of elected individuals that aren't necessarily representative of the state. The other thing that I think is going on is that the Democratic Party, for whatever series of reasons statewide, is not as vibrant as it needs to be. And what I mean, and I'm not saying that from a partisan point of view, I'm saying that from a small d democratic point of view, that this country rests on competition, and it's better when you have viable parties on both sides. So if I'm a member of the state legislature and I'm a Republican, in most of the districts, I'm more worried about someone challenging me in a primary than I am in the general election. So that causes me, as a result, to tilt more towards the right than I might actually like to be. But because I've got to fend off a challenge or a potential challenge, and I'm not too worried about the general election, that changes the dynamic. So I think there's a lack of competition in the state that's probably mostly a product of redistricting, and that's true across the country in a lot of different ways. And so I think that it's, elections are certainly the best manifestation of public opinion, but it's got to have the right kinds of choices. And if you think about, again, going statewide, if all of a sudden Phil Bredesen announced he was going to run for, and let's say he could run for governor or run for Senate, that would change the whole game. I mean, I don't think he'd necessarily win if he was battling Senator Alexander or Governor Haslam, but it'd be a race. It'd be a race. And so I think that, that I cite that example to say there is a lot of moderation out there in the state, but the way it's being aggregated and the state legislature set up, and then if I were a member of the state legislature, given the kinds of competition that isn't coming forth from the Democrats in a lot of ways, I'd be tending to my right side too. Yeah, I think that I would blame a lot of that for the lack of organization on the Democratic side. I mean, here's an example. Take the 2008 election. Tennessee was one of the few election states that went redder. Everybody else went bluer from 04 to 08. Tennessee went redder. There were about 5 other states that did. Along the border of North Carolina and Tennessee, here in the eastern part of the state, all the counties in North Carolina went blue. All the counties in Tennessee went red. Same basic people. What's the difference is that Obama organized the heck out of North Carolina. He has not organized the state of Tennessee. He's not put any money into it. And so as a result, whatever support exists for kind of moderate policies isn't being tended to very well. And that's a product, in my opinion, of the Electoral College. The Electoral College has a lot of bizarre effects, but one of it is that you value some states more than others. When the flood happened in Nashville here, I was always figuring that if in fact it had happened and Tennessee was in Ohio, the president would have been there. But the president didn't come to Nashville. Why? Maybe scheduling. But, it may also be that we weren't a battleground state. And we know that politicians pay attention to the battleground states. Well, first of all, this is funded by Vanderbilt, so it's privately funded. The topics are determined by myself and my co-director in conjunction with our advisory board, which is a mix of Democrats and Republicans. We also will always ask a certain set of questions, always again and again. So we're going to ask more questions about the popularity of the governor. That'll be a time series. We're not going to deviate. But there's a pocket of questions, probably 20 to 30, that we can add and adjust. Some of it's tied by faculty research at Vanderbilt, but other of it's what's the state need. And that's why I was saying that if there's certain questions that come out of your conversations, let us know.
This is on the website somewhere already.
Yep, just go to Vanderbilt, just search on Vanderbilt poll and you'll see it. Well, we haven't asked about that. Asking people whether there's a media effect would be a hard thing. There are some pieces of the poll that show there are real media effects. So for example, the Department of Children's Services, the so-called scandal, that was something the Tennessean carried a lot and spent a lot of time at. People who lived in Nashville were aware of the issue. People outside of Nashville were not. And that's an example of a kind of a media effect. But it's hard, it's very difficult in this day and age to sort out a media effect from partisanship, because what do most Republicans watch on the national news? They watch Fox. Liberals may watch MSNBC. And so how important is it their partisanship or the news media source that's driving it? And that's a total nightmare to figure out. But partisanship is something that's ingrained in you, and it's socialized, and so it's probably the thing that's driving most of it. In fact, there's some recent data, and this should scare you a little bit, that it looks like your partisanship is a product of genetics. So your parents have a lot more explaining to do. just as a little side note.
Jack,
It does swing. I mean, keep in mind that obviously Tennessee, was heavily Democratic, swung to the Republican side. Take a look at other states. New Jersey, when I was a kid, was reliably Republican. California was reliably Republican, and now it's like a centerpiece of the Democratic Party. Vermont, I have a summer home in Vermont. Was the most Republican state from the Civil War until the 1980s, and now it's the home of Ben and Jerry and communism. Okay, and so these things change, and I wouldn't count on it. But I do think that the investment. Roy Herron is, I'm again not speaking from a partisan point of view, but any effort by someone like a Roy Herron and other Democrats to invest isn't going to yield benefits right away. I mean, I cannot imagine the scenario under which the Democrats win the 2014 senatorial or gubernatorial election unless some Tea Party person comes out of the woodwork and defeats them. Then all of a sudden, the Democrats might have a chance if they nominated somebody well. I mean, without the Tea Party, the Democrats would not have control of the U.S. Senate. I mean, that's a fact. The Democrats have benefited from that as far as contrling that body.
Make comments and things like that.
Halloran has to think of what he's going to say. No, but thank you for allowing me to be here. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. It's an interesting kind of comment. I just have one question of John. Since I'm married to a lady who got raised up by a family practitioner in the Upper Cumberland, do we have some way of figuring out what in the heck those people in the Upper Cumberland think about anything, and how in the heck do we help them come out of the dark ages? Because that is a desolate part of the world. And I'm not picking a lot of good people like Howard Baker and Bill Swain and so forth, but golly Moses, that's a different dynamic up there.
Well, I'm grateful to say that polling does not have much, at least statewide polling, to say about that. I can dodge that one with grace. But I mean, you would have to, if you want to figure out what's going on in a particular part of the world, small part, you've actually got to put the same amount of resources in as you do for any other survey. So it becomes, people never understand, if I want to survey China, I have to spend about the same amount of money as I do the city of Nashville. It's a little different, but basically maybe $1,000 more. It's the logic of sampling. It's not the population size, it's the sample size that drives things.
Nothing except a wrap up, but thank you for inviting me. I wasn't sure what we were even talking about today, and I'm actually very pleased to be here to see the poll. I always like to learn something wherever I go and participate, and so this was very valuable to me. And again, it sort of confirmed the thoughts that I have, and so that always makes me happy.
I think we didn't tell you because we wanted your new thoughts.
Right.
I want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this today. All of you in this room are leaders. You're world-class people. My admonition would be make people more important than politics and leverage your influence to help other people do the same thing. I think what I love about leadership programs is it gets the best and the brightest of our state to collaborate, creating something that's better and brighter. And in your individual spheres of influence, you have a limited scope that you can affect, but as you join together, you'll make relationships, you'll make friendships, you'll trust each other, and these relationships can grow into some collaborative things that are really big. But I ask people on the radio every day, what do you think and why do you think it? And I'm really trying to push people to push themselves beyond the tyranny of partisan politics and get to be pragmatic and get things done. People are far more important than politics, at least to me. So, I have a question for you though.
Oh, okay.
So in reading about Obama's reelection, they did a lot of work on Facebook because they could get much more granular detail about people's lives, their preferences, their families, their friends. In the world of polling, are you pushing more, is there a push to reach into social media infrastructure to get that information? Mm-hmm. And is it more data rich and accurate than phone polling?
Well, I don't have enough. Yeah, we can talk about it after. I think the bottom line is that the Obama team was brilliant in gathering all kinds of information. Exactly how powerful that information was is absolutely unclear. In November of 2011, 95% of the American public had decided who they were going to vote for. It was either going to be for or against Obama. This election was driven by partisanship mostly. Even when Obama had a terrible performance in that first debate, it didn't make much difference. People's preferences are pretty set, and so I don't think Facebook has much value except in regards to maybe mobilizing. But even then, it's not entirely clear. There's still a lot more work to be done on that, and we as political scientists just don't know enough. Well, let me just say quickly thank you, obviously, as well. But also, as you guys think about stuff and you think there's some value of some questions or whatever, we are happy to try to put them in the field and take a run at them. We will do one in November. November and May is usually, we want to do it before the legislative session and at the end of the legislative session. We'll do occasionally a poll if we did one of the presidential primary with Santorum and Romney, so we'll be timely but we refused to do one in the election of 2012 because I did not need a poll to tell me that Mitt Romney was going to win the state. And I wanted to do something afterwards to talk about governing. But again, if there was a close election, I could see us trying to do one. But in any case, thank you.
Thanks to the poll.
Thank you, Bill.